Kicking off our list at number 10, first class passengers. While traveling in first class, it might feel more comfortable at first, but when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. You would think obviously, but here's why. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. That's a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people passed away, but in hindsight, a lot of people made it. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats, and then afterwards it was first class men. See, by that point there were few lifeboats left, which I'll get into of course later on, but second class and third class, their chances at survival here right off the bat were not great, simply because they were divided by class. Being stored further and lower from these lifeboats, the odds weren't in their favor. There were more than 700 third class passengers, and that number exceeded the other two classes combined. It's horrible. Those rooms were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out, which we don't often think of when we think of, the Titanic and the sinking of it.
In our 9th spot, we have the haunted hospital. Of course hospitals are haunted. Any place where lots of deaths occur are usually haunted. According to this next nurse, she arrived for her shift early at around 6:30 a.m. Around that time, things were pretty quiet around the hospital. So she gets into the empty elevator and heads on up to the 9th floor. But instead, it skips her floor and ends up going to the 11th floor. The doors open, no one was there, so she closed the doors and clicked the 9th floor button again. When she arrives, she gets off and sees an old woman standing directly behind her in the elevator. I would have had a heart attack. Clearly, this ghostly woman got on at the 11th floor and was hitching a ride down with the nurse. That's terrifying. That's certainly one way to get your heart pumping in the morning. In our 8th spot, we have nearly headless. This next nurse witnessed something that would scar anyone for life. A woman was rushed into the ER after attempting to take her own life. She had slit her wrists and her throat. In fact, she had cut almost her entire hand off, and her head was being held on by the skin at the back of her neck and some muscle. Somehow, she managed to survive the trip to the hospital, but sadly she didn't make it through surgery. On top of it all, the nurse was in charge of holding the woman's head in place while the doctors treated her. And after her passing, the doctor had the nurse look down the woman's neck with the head held back as a little anatomy lesson, which is incredibly messed up. Someone died and he's like, "Hey, now's a great time to study the human body. Come on, take a look." No, just no. Moving on at number 7, we have the motorcycle accident. This story comes from Reddit user Doc in a Box. One night, a motorcycle driver was involved in an accident and suffered from 3rd-degree burns all over his body. Sadly, he was dead on arrival. So this dude's job was to transfer the man from the ambulance gurney to the ER bed. But upon doing so, the charred skin on his back separated and his body slipped to the floor. They were left holding his skin while his body just lay there. In our 6th spot, we have the last moment. This next story is from Reddit user Sad Trombone, who is an ER nurse. One night she was performing CPR on a woman whose heart had stopped. During the middle of chest compressions, the woman's hand reached up and grabbed the nurse's wrist. But immediately after, her hand fell back to hanging off the table. Sadly, the nurse wasn't able to save the woman's life. But imagine how shocking it must have been to have a dead woman's arm shoot up at you and grab ya. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the skeleton man. So this next story comes from an ER doctor. One day there was a man waiting in the ER for treatment. To the eye, nothing looked off about him. That was until he removed the hat that he was wearing. Upon doing so, a chunk of skin about the size of a large male hand just flapped off of his skull. Apparently, the dude managed to scalp himself. But here's the thing. This happened 3 days ago, and he was only now getting treatment. Turns out he was duct taping it down so that it would stay on, or he was wearing that hat so it would stay in place. Eventually, when the hat trick wasn't working as well, his wife convinced him to come into the hospital. I can't. Like, isn't that painful? How do you wait 3 days before treatment? No. Coming in at number 4, we have the makeshift bandage. So if you ever get injured, leave it to the professionals to help you, okay? Chances are you're only gonna make things worse, like this next guy. So apparently this guy was out hiking when he fell on some rocks. The rocks ended up cutting a 3-inch long, half-inch deep gash into his leg. When he arrived at the ER, he had a bandage on his leg. When it was peeled off, his wound was completely black with dark chunks of fungus falling out of the wound. Apparently, when he was hiking, the man decided to make a makeshift bandage by chewing up leaves and moss and then mixing it with mud from the river, and then he literally stuffed it into his leg to seal the wound. That's what I like to call an infection waiting to happen. In our third spot, we have the man in the room. Imagine looking after a patient who told you he was seeing ghosts in his room. This is exactly what happened to this next ER nurse. So the patient was admitted to a room in the ER at around 1:30 in the morning. But as soon as he was rolled into the room, he started freaking out, talking about him. He kept asking the nurses if they could see him. He was so freaked out he demanded a new room. Once in the new room, he was fine and he fell asleep. The next morning, the nurse went to check in on the man, and that's when he said that the hospital room needs to be exorcised. Apparently, the him he was talking about is a very angry dead man who didn't want anyone else in his room. I would refuse to ever go in that room if I was her. On top of that, the nurse claims that weird things would always happen in that room, like it was always cold no matter what, and the lights would always flicker on and off by themselves. Of course, she never thought much of it until this man came in and told her it was indeed haunted. In our second spot, we have the puncture wound. This next guy was admitted into the ER after a full-on fence entered his torso just below his ribs and exited his body above his opposite shoulder. That's a big yikes. Apparently he got into a car accident and hit a fence, which then went right through his car and then right through him. The dude was fully conscious when he arrived to the ER and apparently told the nurse, and I quote, "I seem to have a splinter that I think you might need to remove. Honey, I think it's more than just a splinter." Thankfully, the man managed to survive getting the post and all the wood chips out of his body, but he did have to spend 1 month in the ICU. And in our number one spot today, we have the limb. This next man came into the ER claiming that his arm had been lopped off during a farming accident. He pointed to his left arm, but his left arm appeared to be intact. It wasn't unattached at all. But they did notice that the man was holding a blanket over his shoulder. When they took the blanket away from him, his whole left arm came with it. I would have fainted. That's a big no from me. Starting off this countdown, we have the wrong turn. So this is a real story reported by 4 university students. Their names were never disclosed to protect their identity. But apparently in May of 1972, they were on their way back from a Utah rodeo and headed to their dorm. On their way back, they decided to take a shortcut. But that was their first mistake. While traveling along this unknown road, the path suddenly turned into gravel, and then all of a sudden they hit a dead end. So they had to travel all the way back down the road that they just came. However, while doing so, they noticed that the path had changed. It didn't look like the same original path that they originally took. All of a sudden, they saw something glowing in the distance. They drove towards it and found themselves at a weird building with a neon sign. The neon sign was in a language that none of them recognized. When they pulled towards the building for help, these weird tall men came out towards them. They seemed confused and angry. One got close to the car and one of the girls screamed. The tall man didn't appear to be human, so they sped out of there. While driving away, they saw weird egg-shaped vehicles following them. They sped until the vehicles stopped following them. Finally, they somehow reached the road that they were originally on. To this day, they believe that they somehow traveled to another universe through that road. Isn't that creepy? Hit that thumbs up button if you agree.
Number 9, the band. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know that music can heal a lot of people, of course. While I'm absolutely sure there is nothing that could have been done to completely erase people's worries about what was about to happen on the Titanic that fateful night, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was to play music, and I'm sure that helped somebody in some way, shape, or form. It wasn't just in the movie, right? The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up. First, it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that still would have been insanely brave of them too, but it turns out this is far from the truth. See, the band members were in fact not ship employees at the time, which means they technically had the same rights as any other passenger to leave and board a ship, but they chose not to. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad, but also very beautiful and heroic of them. The film can't can't quite capture the beauty. I'm sure their heroism helped a lot of people who are also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad their acts have been remembered, even still. Number 8. Locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic that fateful night, and Tanky magazine actually published her survival story afterwards, titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Yeah, I mentioned the first class differences between third class, so this story here is already a feat in itself. Ellen and her husband, Pekko, decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound, and the engines then started to act up. Pekko ran out to see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by the time Ellen poked her head out moments later, once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. Then there was a knock at the door. One of her friends from Finland came in, and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen, and her friend asked, how did he get out of the passageway? All the doors are locked. I was confused. I didn't know what to do next. After a few moments, I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to third deck, where they were then taken to the Carpathia, and they didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the following day. So after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Ellen only received $125. That's all the ship could give them. They're like, we're sorry you lost everything, here's the best we can do. That's it. Number 7. No binoculars. On that fateful night of the collision with the iceberg, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Now, of course, this could have changed literal history had they have been used, but why weren't they? The key to said lockup storing the binoculars was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Now, of course, this may not have made a difference at all, but it's important to note. To think that these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest the entire time is haunting now when you consider the history of it. The poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot a key. The amount of times I've forgotten a key or taken a work key home by accident, I mean, it's a simple mistake, but in this case, tragedy, really. Number 6. Ignored flares. Just 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, and the crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about icebergs. The Titanic had received 6 warnings about icebergs before the collision. Now, while the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all 6 were. Why so? The captain of this other boat, he slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought that they were company rockets. The SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. Yep, he took a little power nap after ignoring all the flares. By the time they had heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was obviously too late, sadly. Number 5. Less lifeboats. Before the Titanic even set sail during the preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. Why they did this? Beats me, I don't know. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is truly trivial when we're talking about the safety of, 2,208 passengers that were on board that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were, collapsible. So 24-ish lifeboats, 2,208 passengers. Doesn't add up. It's not, it's a terrible ratio. Which means they should have had time to launch every single one, but this would still be only enough for half the passengers on board. It was cursed from the get-go. And as you may or may not know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything happened too quickly, and it was chaos. There are quite a few lessons that can be definitely learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that safety precautions taken for these ships simply were just not up to par. It wasn't really about the iceberg. I mean, that did it, but there were other things that could have helped. Number 4, the card. In the remnants of the Titanic, there was an inspection card found that belonged to a woman named Marianne Meanwell. This must seem like any ordinary find after a wreck, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was then revealed that Marianne was not intended to be on the Titanic at all, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card shows us that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but for some reason, the trip she'd originally planned was delayed, and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see the word Majestic was actually crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. It's so haunting to look at now. There's no way anybody could have known or warned her. It's just a really tragic situation to look back on. And to physically see the cancellation of the ship gives me goosebumps. That's really horrible. Number 3, ELIZA MILLVINA Dean. This story really is something, okay, buckle up. When thinking back to this tragedy, it's hard to imagine how it looked in real time, like being on the ship, right? I mean, not from James Cameron's perspective, right? It was a moonless night in the pitch black. Of course the navigation was hard. Of course it could have been handled better, or they could have listened to the numerous warnings, but again, it was pitch black. This is what the iceberg looked like in real life. Eliza Dean was only a newborn on the Titanic. Her parents were on the way to the States with everything that they owned packed up in their luggage. See, Eliza's father was actually on the deck at the time of the collision, so he saw the ship hit that iceberg. How terrifying is that? But in doing so, he knew in that moment, get the family, hit the deck, something bad's gonna happen. Even as third-class passengers, they were thankfully some of the first on the lifeboats, which is incredible seeing as what I said earlier. It was Eliza, her brother, and her mother. They all got aboard safely, but her father, of course, never made it off, which is terrible. But his quick thinking saved his family. Number 2, John Jacob Astor. As the ship was sinking, the first-class passenger, John Jacob Astor, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats, and he was about to get in with her when he immediately saw 2 terrified children standing behind him. And it happened. He instead gave up his spot and let those other 2 children on the boat, which is just noble, it's brave, it's heroic. It's something that you ask yourself, could I do that? If it actually were to happen, would I have the willpower to do that? I hope so. This is absolute bravery. One of the Titanic survivors, named Philip Mock, saw John in one of his final moments later on after this brave moment. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. It's tragic. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news here is that both his wife and the child that she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety, and they survived the entire ordeal. While there are many terrible stories from this day, we also don't hear enough about the bravery that people showed during this tragic event. And finally, number 1, Molly Brown. In total, there were 706 people who survived the sinking of the Titanic. Molly Brown has been referred to as the unsinkable Molly Brown, and when you look into her story, it really checks out. Margaret Brown not only survived the Titanic, which is just an incredible feat in itself, and the odds there are just incredible, but once aboard the life ship, she threatened the quartermaster. She said she'll throw him overboard if he didn't go back immediately and start looking for more survivors. That's badass. That is something I will do. I hope I can do in a moment like this. That's incredible. Historically, this is where the accounts get a little hazy. See, it's not confirmed whether the boat actually went back to look, but after narrowly surviving a tragedy, then you're barely conscious. You still think of other people? That's the moral of the story here. Margaret was traveling in Egypt, but when a grandchild got sick, she ended her trip early just to go back to the States and take care of them. Once she got all this attention after surviving said disaster, she then campaigned publicly for women's rights and education for the poor. She was a badass in the boat and then a badass afterwards. Like, this is insane. There was a musical comedy in the 60s called The Unsinkable Molly Brown, so her name will be remembered for a while. As it should be. Thank you, Molly.
Starting off this countdown, we have the car accident. About a decade ago, this nurse used to work in a suburban hospital. One night there was a multiple vehicle accident, and one of the accident victims arrived to the ER with his foot barely attached to his leg. It was just dangling from his ankle. Apparently when his car was struck, his foot was at a different angle from the rest of his body, so when it received impact, it literally snapped right off. This nurse was traumatized after walking by his bed and seeing one normal foot and then seeing the other just dangling there with his tendons and ligaments completely visible, dripping with blood. In our 9th spot, we have the Lyft ride and the disappearing store. Just recently, Reddit user NoBookkeeper3991 decided to take a Lyft to go to the dollar store. It wasn't too far from his place, and it wasn't complicated to get to. A couple minutes go by and he should have reached the store by now, but they couldn't find it. The store just randomly wasn't there anymore. In fact, the whole street looked different. Both the dude and the Lyft driver started to panic. Everything changed in front of them in a flash. It was super weird. So yeah, the guy didn't end up going to the dollar store that day. Apparently, they rode into a parallel universe or something. And of course, days later, the missing dollar store magically reappeared again. Moving on at number 8, we have the disappearing professor. A well-known faculty member at the University of the Andes disappeared on campus without a trace. According to multiple witnesses, they saw the professor leave one of the university's buildings, cross the parking lot, and get into his car. Many people saw this happen. In fact, people were calling at him and waving to him as he got into his car. But his car sat there unmoving for a while. A couple of students actually approached the car to see what was going on and found the car empty. The professor was nowhere to be found. To this day, the professor has never returned. It's assumed that when he got into his car, he was transported to a different universe. Moving on at number 7, we have the Green Children of Woolpit. Back in the 13th century, 2 weird children randomly appeared in the village of Woolpit in England. The 2 were brother and sister and had weird greenish colored skin. To make things weirder, they spoke a language no one heard of, and they were dressed in weird clothing. They also didn't want to eat anything except raw beans. Eventually, they were taken in, but sadly, the boy became sick and passed away. The girl, on the other hand, started to like normal food and started to lose the green color in her skin. After learning to speak English, she said that her and her brother were from a place where people had green skin and the sun didn't shine bright. They were herding their dad's cattle when all of a sudden they heard a loud noise. Bam! They were in a new place. Now the girl ended up growing up and marrying a man and starting a whole new life there. But it seems like the two traveled there from another dimension. Coming in at number 6, we have the campsite. A couple of years ago, a woman and her friends were out camping when they heard music coming from the forest. They followed the sound thinking that they were alone and came across a small stone cabin. The weirdest part? When they approached the cabin, they saw people dressed in 17th century fashion. One of the friends was fascinated and went over to the cabin to try and go inside. As she was about to enter, one of her friends pulled her away. As that happened, half of her body became paralyzed, the half that entered the cabin. It's believed that she partially entered another dimension, and that threw off her nervous system, which resulted in half of her body becoming paralyzed. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the deaths. This story is pretty intense, so buckle your seatbelts. But basically, one night this woman had a dream about someone she knew dying. 3 days later, that dream came true and the person passed away. This has happened to her a number of times. She falls asleep, has a dream that someone dies, and in exactly 3 days, that dream comes true and that person passes away. I mean, that sounds like a horror movie plot, like if you agree. Anyways, this has happened to 2 of her colleagues, 3 of her grandparents, her great-grandfather, her friend's grandfather, 2 school teachers, 3 of her friends, and a random lady she met for 5 minutes one day at work. So maybe don't become friends with her, because then she'll have a dream about you and then you'll die. I'm just kidding. But some people believe that she's actually hopping from different universes. In one universe, the person has already passed away. When she jumps back to her current universe, the person isn't dead yet. And that's what triggers these dreams. They're just memories from other universes that she has traveled to. In our 4th spot, we have the different family home. Back in the day, a woman named Carol Chase McElhenney decided to visit her old family town and area. But when she was driving down her old street, she couldn't find the old house that she grew up in. In fact, all the houses on the street looked completely different. She then decided to drive to the street where her grandmother used to live on. But when she got there, she found that the street was completely different as well. She then was driving through the town, noticing that almost everything was changed. Like the cemetery where her parents were buried wasn't there anymore. Or a strip of restaurants and hotels was now just a graffiti-covered area. She started feeling very uncomfortable and drove off. A few years later, Carol's father died and they went back to the cemetery to bury him with his parents. Surprisingly, the cemetery magically reappeared and everything about the town was back to normal. So she believes that during her other trip, she managed to visit her old town from a different dimension. In our 3rd spot, we have the birth certificate. Just recently, Reddit user Professional Echo 348 went to get a new birth certificate. They were at town hall when they saw that their mother's middle name was not right. It was written as Victoria, but her real middle name was Virginia. So she asked the clerk what was up with it. Even her last birth certificate had her mom's middle name as Virginia. Sadly, her mom passed away 17 years ago, so she couldn't just phone up her mom and ask her what was up. Plus, she even named her daughter's middle name after her mom's middle name. So she decided to dig into this some more. She was going through old files when she saw that her mother was once married to a man named Pierce, which again was wrong. His name was actually Pierre, not Pierce. So sometime in her life, she switched universes. One where her mother's middle name was Victoria and her stepfather's name was Pierce. Coming in at number 2, we have the different girlfriend. One day, a guy woke up only to find that he had been sleeping next to some random girl. He freaked out, and the girl, whose name was Laura, was all like, WTF, we've been dating for a couple of years now. How don't you remember? Stop fooling around, this isn't funny. Sure enough, his apartment was filled with framed photos of them together. What's weird is that wasn't his girlfriend. He was dating a girl named Maria, not Laura. So apparently, he went to bed with Maria and woke up beside a new girlfriend, Laura. So somehow he managed to switch universes in his sleep. That is insane. And does that count as cheating? Let me know in the comments below. And in our number 1 spot, we have LORINA GARCIA. LORINA GARCIA lived a pretty mundane life.
until one day, everything changed forever. Her life literally got flipped upside down. So she woke up one day and noticed her bed sheets were different than normal. She kind of just ignored it and went on with her day. But as she made her way to work, she noticed little things were off. Again, she ignored it as she arrived at work. But when she got to her department, she realized it wasn't her department. She thought that she was on the wrong floor, but she wasn't. She had worked there for the last 20 years. But today, she worked in a different department. She even looked herself up on her work's database. She worked at the same company, but it said she worked at a different department. Then things continued to get weird. Her former boyfriend disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of him anywhere. There was not even a sign that the two had even dated. In fact, she hired someone to see what happened to him. Turns out, he never existed. At least not in this universe. Her current boyfriend was someone completely different. So somehow, when Lorina went to bed, she managed to travel to another universe. Isn't that crazy? Like, imagine waking up and having a completely new job and partner. I would freak out and probably go insane.